WISC TV now presents For the Record.
Stretching for a more competitive state and smarter kids is next on For the Record. Thanks for joining us. I'm Neil Heinen. For much of his career, Dave Baskerville advised businesses, many in Japan, to think long-term for sustainable success. He proposed using stretch targets, goals, and data. Now retired, Baskerville sees the state of Wisconsin facing challenges that cannot be met with the short-term thinking that has become the norm these days. And he is proposing stretch targets in response, and he is asking people, you, to sign on. I welcome to For the Record, Dave Baskerville.
Thank you, Neil.
Dave, thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
Nice to see you. So start at the beginning. You know, where did this whole idea of stretch targets come from?
Well, I'm not sure exactly where it came from, and it's not my term, Neil, but I worked for two companies before I retired, Weyerhaeuser and Secor. Weyerhaeuser was paper and wood, and Secor was a startup fiber optic cable company. And I was in positions senior to start thinking long-term and seeing where we ought to be, where we can be, not where we were. And so that's where I started using it, and I could document that as being, quote, successful. Then when I retired, came back to Madison after 40 years, I got into consulting and did much the same thing with almost entirely American companies. Some it wasn't appropriate, some it didn't work, but oftentimes when a company has a new opportunity or is in trouble and a leader, a CEO, or a top executive commits to something longer term, whatever that means, and then sustains that commitment, it's amazing what you can get out of your workers. It's amazing where you can move and do things that most people did not think were possible. And usually in the organization, the first reaction is can't do it, shouldn't do it, no one's ever done it, no resources to do it.
No, is that the definition of a stretch target? Is long-term thinking and sustainable?
Yep, that's my definition of it. Yep, yes. And so when it came, I live a half a block from the Capitol in our hometown here in Madison. We love the city, we love Wisconsin, but I've been disappointed in where we're going in at least a couple of areas. And I'm not an activist. People will debate that lately. I'm not a Republican or a Democrat. I'm not an economist nor an educator. But I just think that we're not moving in a way that we should. We should expect far more from ourselves. And the experiences were a client up in Minnesota I had for several years, and so I spent a lot of time up there. And I just felt that something was going on in Minnesota that was not going on in Wisconsin. So finally, I looked at some data, and sure enough, at least since 1980, perhaps earlier, per capita income increasingly grew faster in Minnesota than in Wisconsin. That year, they were number 19, we were number 18. They're somewhere between 10 and 12, depending on the year now. And we're up about number 25. So it isn't something that started yesterday or with any given governor. But that's the stretch target for the economy. 2037, 20 years out, let's be 10% per capita better than Minnesota. After all, they now have an economy that generates $4,900 per capita more than we do. And that means a lot in all kinds of areas. The second experience was going through hundreds of factories and offices in East Asia and a fair number in Europe and the US, and just having a sense that our workers it was more difficult to train our workers than the ones I was seeing, both STEM as well as blue collar. Again, at some point, I took a look at the education and training people had as they came in to the workforce. And I looked at the PISA scores, these international comparison tests that some 60 countries take, OECD, UN sponsored. And America comes out, say, number 37 in math, 27 in science, somewhere around number 23 in reading. And I said again, you know, we can do better. Our kids are great kids, and we just don't expect enough from them. We have long-term issues, challenges, and we have people not like me that are long-term citizens, most of us, and we have short-term oriented politicians and school board members. Yep. And so what are you going to do? I don't think we're going to move them with any policy change. I think it has to be something grassroots where enough of us Wisconsinites say, hey, we can expect a lot more of ourselves. We can expect to grow like many other states in the economy, and we can be in the top 10 globally in science, math, and reading, as we were back when I was a kid at West High School.
Yeah. You know, the idea of long-term thinking, I mean, we've had blue ribbon commissions and task forces, and we've had experts at the academic level who have, over the years, you know, it's not a new idea, and yet we seem less able than ever to do that kind of thinking. How would you describe the barriers to that? What's changed? What gets in the way here?
Well, I think one thing is we have these studies. They're very good. They're useful. They're informative oftentimes, and they're accurate, I think, as best I can tell, and as people tell me. But we don't sustain them into somehow action. And one of the keys of stretch targets is a scorecard. It's a scorecard that isn't 240 pages that describes the issues and challenges of our economy or our education system, but it's one that every citizen can understand. And I used the illustration of the Packers. I just happen to be a Packer fan since the early 40s. And you know, it's a complex game, offense, defense, special teams, managing $1 million players, film, drafting. It's pretty complex. And of course, us fans Monday morning during the football season know all the answers that Mike McCarthy was not aware of the day before.
Of course.
But there is one thing we all understand, and that is the scorecard on Monday morning. It's simple. It's, yes, there should be an asterisk, there were too many injuries and Rodgers went down or whatever, but week after week and season after season, that's accountability that every one of us fans who aren't experts on football can understand. That's what we don't have in politics. We have reports and we have explanations, but I think us citizens, Joe Smith and Jane Evans or whatever, you know, we can't summarize what's going on here nor track it. And so with these stretch targets, there's a scorecard both for the per capita income and for to be specific, 15-year-olds who would take a PISA test. They could take it every 3 years and compare it with other countries. There is a PISA test now that the OECD has generated where Wisconsin and American high schools can take it annually. They don't do that. We don't benchmark there.
Well, I want to look at these two stretch targets in depth, one at a time. We're going to do that when we come back right after this with Dave Baskerville. Could we set some goals for making Wisconsin more economically competitive and more globally competitive in education? Can we set some targets, some stretch targets? That's what we're talking about this morning with Dave Baskerville, who is proposing stretch targets, and we're going to tell you how you can sign on, because really the idea is to gather citizen support that our elected officials, our elected leaders will pay attention to in trying to achieve these two stretch targets. The first of which is in comparison to Minnesota, to close the gap. This is so commonly referred to now these days, for per capita income. So when you talk about the scorecard, Dave, what are some benchmarks that would be helpful in knowing that we are actually accomplishing this?
Well, first of all, we would have that scorecard that every citizen could track, Neil. Benchmarks would range from doubling or tripling venture capital here to getting big companies like Kikkoman in Walworth County and perhaps Foxconn here.
Yep.
FDI, there's lots of money out there in China and Japan and Germany, as well as in the U.S. to bring in bigger operations, some more technical, some more blue collar. I think another key is to make sure that we have our state ready. And what comes to mind there is that we work with, say we, the WADA people, the commercial people, the private sector works with DNR to make sure that, yes, we're abiding by those guidelines that DNR has. Maybe some are not practical and should be changed, but more importantly, that we have a process that expedites the process such that a company comes in and says, hey, this is predictable. This we can do, this we can't do. Yep. And within spreading these issues out and debating for years, a company just can't afford that. So this is the thing we need. We also need incentives to keep our good companies, our big companies here. When a company like U.S. Bank moved their headquarters from Milwaukee to Minnesota in 1999, I've not seen numbers, but people tell me we lost $10 to $20 million with all the executives going, sure, the staff work, and many things else. So keep the good companies and big companies here, and then give incentives to some of the smaller companies. I think we have to give incentives for companies like Foxconn to come in. I don't know any of the details of that particular offer, but I think it's very encouraging. But at the same time, we have to be ready for it. And we also, I think, have to make sure, and this is another issue, is having our workers trained. Yep. Because I'm hearing already, just anecdotally, tech companies, software companies, even in Madison, saying, boy, I can't find the people. You go out to Watertown to some of those manufacturing plants, what's their problem? It's people. Can't you train the people? Of course we can, but we can't teach them remedial reading. So there's benchmarks all.
Those are great examples, yep, Dave. Now it strikes me that you left off the one that everybody talks about, which is tax ranking. Yep. It's not about tax ranking.
Well, I don't think in the economy it is. I mean, Minnesota is also a high tax. So. You know, they may use their tax money, which is high, better than we do. They have a third of the people in prison that we do, and yet have the same demographics and the same level of violent crime. But that in itself, I mean, you need taxes to build roads and infrastructure. You've got to get the fiber optics and the Wi-Fi out to the rural areas. There's a lot of infrastructure, in addition to education, which probably doesn't require a lot more money, but it needs direction.
I mean, I think obviously the two stretch targets are tied together in that very, very important way. I mean, you almost have to have the one before you can get the other. So, you know, the United States doesn't rank as high competitively in educated kids, I think, as a lot of people would think. And, you know, more and more, I think people are getting comfortable with the idea that countries like Finland and South Korea and are really doing much better in educating our kids. Yep. So rising up that ranking would be one part of the benchmark. But again, what are some steps along the way, Dave, that we could look for
in education?
Yes, sure, to know that we're going in the right direction.
Well, the one state that really has moved well above all other states in education, K through 12, is Massachusetts. Yes. Wisconsin and Massachusetts were about even Steven back in 1993 in terms of their achievement, and they did just three things. Not enough, I think, but just three things. They said, look, our lawyers and our doctors, we're tough on them before we certify. We're going to certify our teachers in our system vis-a-vis their subject. If you're a third grade science teacher, fifth grade math teacher, whatever. And we're going to be tough. It's going to be very tough certification. The first year in Massachusetts, half were certified. Didn't fire anyone, gave them 6 years. The second thing they did is with high school education. They didn't just say, well, we're going to increase the % of those who graduate. It's going to be tough, much tougher to graduate in Massachusetts. And if not, people are just going to fail. Didn't fail any of the kids the first year, gave them 6 years. And then the thing that is probably most surprising or interesting for us Wisconsinites is that they sustained that commitment through 3 administrations, 2 Democratic and 1 Republican, and didn't go one way and the other. They sustained that. And about year 4, you could see Massachusetts moving ahead of the rest of the country. And today, I think it's reading, it could be math, is actually approaching global levels. Now, they don't use the PISA test as I think, you know, they could have, but boy, that has made a huge difference, just those 3 things. In a sense, very difficult, but keep in mind Massachusetts is basically a Democratic state. It's a union state, and they've really accomplished something that no other state has decided to follow.
Well, and I think that's a great example of the promise of stretch targets, yep. Which is, if established and widely accepted, mm-hmm. They will transcend government and politics. They become part of the state's identity, not any political party's yep. identity. Yep. Well, when we come back, I want to talk about how citizens can help with this and how we get these stretch targets implemented right after this. My guest is Dave Baskerville, who in his retirement after a long, successful career in business is taking an idea called stretch targets, which worked in business, and applying it to Wisconsin's competitiveness as a state, both economically and in education. So you've got literally a sign-up sheet, Dave, mm-hmm. that people can sign on to, and yep. you've got a goal for getting names. Talk about, you know, that initial goal.
Sure. Well, the goal is, it's got to be grassroots, as I mentioned. It's got to be us citizens that just say, hey, we've had enough. We don't have all the answers. There's a lot of challenges with the implementation, but here's the kind of state we'd like to be in 20 years. And interestingly, if you look up at the 435 people who have signed up, Neil, I would guess they're pretty much even between what we would call conservatives and progressives. When you look out that far, you lose some of the polarization that we all are concerned about in Wisconsin. That's not the purpose of it. Yep. The purpose is to get results and to get better jobs, not just real income that doesn't move for 20 years. It's to keep our 10,000 university graduates that net leave Wisconsin every year back in the state, and it's for social mobility. How do you get the what we might call the underclass and the gap? I think the only way to bring folks, and it's been this way for a long time in Wisconsin, how do you bring them up into the middle class? It's through world-class education. We had it in the 50s and 60s. We can have it again. Yep. Now, how do we do this from 430 to 10,000? Well, we're going to launch a Facebook August 7th. They're asking me to write a mandate, a paper, a page and a half, in which I briefly describe here's what would have to happen, which might help leadership. We're also working on a logo and eventually Twitter, and we are organizing the effort, the endeavor, into a 501c3, and we just need a lot of people. What do you do when you sign up? Well, you get the scorecard twice a year. You'll get a one or two sentence message in between 4 or 5 times a year. That's it. That's what we're asking for. And
you're traveling the state, talking to people yep. In all corners.
Yep, and anyone who wants to do their thing, whether it's arranging for a desk at the farmer's market in Waupaca or Madison, or whether they think that something could be done with TED Talks, or I encourage them, just go ahead, take the initiative. We'll supply, hopefully, the resources that are necessary and the guidance.
And you know, one result might be in the governor's race, in the school superintendent's race, that a candidate would say, I embrace these 2 stretch targets, and his or her opponent would say, I do too.
Oh, that'd be wonderful.
Right? I mean, that's
because it's not a partisan issue in this case. And yes, when we get down to the hows of this, there'll be battles, as there always is when you implement a policy. And there'll be good discussions, but we, the citizens, will have that scorecard, Neil, that'll keep people accountable and not just let the discussions run out of spit.
Do you have any sense, Dave, about the diversity of support for this? Are you speaking to other races, other cultures?
Sure. Well, I don't have a profile of the 435. I know it's more Madison-centric than it has to be just because I live here. Yep. And although I was gone for 40 years, I know a fair number of people here. Greg St. Fort, who is with 100 State, is a key player in this whole thing.
Yep, he's been on this show. He's
been
great.
on this show. Yep. He's a millennial.
Yep.
And
right.
yeah, it's a real struggle to do that. Greg knows that. He happens to be African American as well, and I have friends who are African American, certainly those who are Asian American. I can't really describe the diversity, but we have to have everyone, not only in terms of politics, yep, but in terms of age and racial makeup as well.
We probably don't have time to talk about all your contacts in Milwaukee, but I know that you've been talking to the Milwaukee school folks, too.
Oh, yes. Yeah, and there's success stories. People have done this in the hood of Milwaukee. We could talk at another time, Eric, as well as in the affluent schools such as Kettle Moraine, where they're really taking these PISA tests and are moving towards global levels. Yeah. So it's doable. It's doable in Massachusetts. It's doable in Poland, in Finland, in South Korea, and 30 other countries. And Neil, almost in every case, in my limited experience, they started these programs in dire poverty.
Yep.
It wasn't like they were fat cats in terms of their economy when they started this effort.
Go to stretchtargets.org. You can sign up right there. And thank you, Dave Baskerville, for joining me.
Thank you.
We're going to come back and wrap up For the Record right after this. My thanks to Dave Baskerville and to you for joining us on For the Record. Have a good rest of your weekend. See you next week.